Bitcoin is almost aligning us back to our path and giving us more capacity to listen to our intuition and look inwards, as opposed to being stuck, constantly looking outwards and constantly trying to survive.
Hey everyone, this week we are doing an in-person episode. Seb Bunny is back, live in the studio.
Oh, such a good conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys think, but we touched on everything from spirituality to AI, and of course with Scott, we can't get away from some conspiracy theories. But I enjoyed it and looking forward to hearing what you guys think.
Stick around. Okay, welcome to another episode of the Block Reward Podcast. This week we are in studio, which is a new thing for us, something we want to do more over time, joined by very special guest, Seb Bunny, our very own Seb Bunny. Seb, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's nice to be here.
Yeah.
I feel like we recorded, when was it? Early on in the Block Rewards podcast, and we recorded another team one with John as well. And it's just nice to be able to speak to like-minded individuals, even though we get a chat every day, actually record our conversations.
Yeah, we do talk all the time, but I think we'll be doing more of this as we go.
Mm-hmm.
And good to have you here.
It's good to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. I feel like we chatted briefly before we jumped on. When it comes to kind of the Bitcoin space, it's really easy to get caught up in macro and the numbers. And I think what you and I both resonate with is more of the philosophical, the spiritual side of Bitcoin. And so I'm really looking forward to just chatting.
So where do you want to start?
Let's go. Before we started talking, you were mentioning something about a clock.
Oh, yeah. So I have been interested for a long time in the way different Bitcoiners think about time. And the most famous one is GG's Bitcoin is time. I think there's been some really cool discussion about this subject, and which we've talked about many times today for the listeners. Now, there are a lot of clock-like aspects to what happens in Bitcoin. And this is one of GG's ideas, is that timekeeping is an ordering of events. And so ledgering, like a Bitcoin ledger in itself, is a record keeping that has to do with timekeeping. And obviously, Bitcoin has a procedural nature that has units, and like we have seconds and minutes and hours, and in Bitcoin we have blocks and difficulty adjustment periods and epochs. And so Bitcoin also has this kind of like order to it. And so there's an obvious relationship between Bitcoin and time. And, I also think about this concept of money has a relationship to time, whether we acknowledge it or not. And it should, because we really use money to kind of price time. And we think about how much time we need to spend to earn a certain amount of money to buy something we want. Or we might think about how much we are paid per hour or per year. So we are pricing time. We're thinking about the price of time all the time. And then, of course, we have this really weird problem that relates to infinitely expanding money, is that the amount of time we have does not change. And the amount of money that everyone is working with is continuously changing, which really muddies what should be a relationship. And that's where I think is a really cool idea that I talk about in my book, that, with Bitcoin, energy really binds the relationship between energy and time, which gives us a very neat foundation to start both thinking about time differently, but to ground our understanding of time into like a different reality.
It's, as you're saying this, kind of what comes to mind is across many industries, when you see a standardization of something, the efficiency benefits of that standardization are usually huge. And so we spoke very briefly, but it's like when time came about in terms of the clock, all of a sudden people were able to align, and you saw efficiency benefits. People could choose when to meet, what the average day looked like and such. And what I think is interesting about money is just a unit of measurement. And the problem is that unit of measurement is being co-opted, it's being corrupted. And so it's throwing off everyone's ability to align. And so I think that when we think about money and the transfer of value from a free market perspective, money flows to where value is being created. So if you step back a very high level of a nation state, you would see areas of the economy which are thriving, capital is flowing towards them. Areas of the economy which are suffering and not really offering value, they're not offering products that people want, money would slowly drip away from them and towards areas of the economy that are thriving. And what's interesting is when you intervene monetarily, when you start printing money, when you start putting regulations in place, capital controls in place, you're altering the flow of natural capital. It's like you're altering time. You're distorting this like standardized measurement that throws everyone off. Because in the entrepreneurial world, we build products that we think people are going to want. But if you're artificially propping up a whole industry and you're an entrepreneur, you're like, it looks like people value this thing. But in reality, they don't value it. It's that money is artificially flowing to this whole area of an economy that should not exist. And so I think that this idea of like standardization, having a form of a clock that continually ticks and gives us something at which to benchmark from or reference, helps us as an individual show up more authentically, helps us as an individual determine what's true in society, what it is that people actually value. I find that kind of stuff fascinating.
Yeah. And so the idea actually that we were talking about before the show came from an essay that was written in 1944 by a man named George Woodcock, an economist. And that essay is called The Tyranny of the Clock. And the concept is that the invention of the mechanical clock just sort of eminently predated the Enlightenment and then subsequently the Industrial Revolution. And that it was that innovation which allowed us to properly and sort of scientifically measure time in a way that previously was impossible. And that as a result, we started to think about kind of turning time into a commodity in a way that was also previously not possible. And in the essay, George suggests that during the evolution of the Industrial Revolution, the most valuable raw material, the input was time as understood as the workers' ability to spend their time working. And it's a really a wild idea, this notion that flash forward hundreds of years later, and we have now really, as a result of this imperfect relationship between expanding money and finite time, we've now all become slaves to time. So this is what the tyranny of the clock is in Woodcock's mind, is that we have become slaves to clocks. And which is, I think, a very piercing and fierce statement. Like we do really manage our lives now to the minute. And I talk about this all the time. I think it's just totally insane how we've got to a place where, if you don't capture someone's attention in the first 3 seconds of a TikTok, they're moving on to the next video. It's like, that's really where we've gone, is the inability for us to correctly price time and the continual expansion of money make it just impossible to fairly gauge time. So we become less and less willing to spend the same amount of time doing anything that we are uncertain will be worth that amount of time.
It's tough because I think that the current monetary system, actually, you and I were talking about it last night. We went for a walk and, oh man, it was an amazing sunset. And we went for this walk and we were talking about this parasite, Toxoplasma gondii. And cats in cat feces have this parasite. And when rats or mice come along those feces, if they consume them or they're near them, brush up against them, this parasite eventually just kind of invades, works its way to kind of the brain of that rodent. And eventually that rodent completely loses its inhibition, its ability to make decisions, and is actually drawn to cats. And it's this parasite which basically just like sucks it in and puts itself in situations that are not beneficial to the rodent. Now, what's interesting is I almost see like kind of the state and money as the parasite today. The state and money, because money is increasingly losing purchasing power and life is getting harder and harder and harder, what do? We continually focus on money. We continually focus on the state, needing those handouts, needing that support, even though it's detrimental to us. And what I think is fascinating is that Bitcoin, in a sense, is the first time in history we have an antidote to that. Gold was trying to be that antidote, but gold has been corrupted. And so Bitcoin is an antidote to this parasite, which is kind of like the state and state-controlled money, which is slowly increasing our fixation on simply just survival and focusing on money. And I find the irony of Bitcoin being money is that it gets us to stop thinking about money. Because as our purchasing power is increasing over time, as technology is advancing, as we're improving in efficiency and productivity, prices should be falling in relation to Bitcoin. So life starts to get easier. And as life gets easier, we have more capacity. As we have more capacity, we think less about money and we think more about how we want to show up. We think more about the family. We think more about what it is that we value in our trajectory. And I think that that's something along these lines of kind of like money, fiat money, government kind of being this parasite. It's taking us off our path. Bitcoin is almost aligning us back to our path and giving us more capacity to listen to our intuition and look inwards, as opposed to being stuck, constantly looking outwards and constantly trying to survive. Because when we're stuck in this fear state, when we're stuck in the survival state, I feel like our aperture of awareness just narrows and narrows and narrows.
Yeah, it's a complicated problem. I think one of my favorite models of consciousness is it's 3 spheres, and the ideal state. So each sphere is the past, the present, and the future. And in the ideal model, the present is like the biggest sphere by far. So you've got a little bit, a small circle in the past and a small circle in the future. And what this state signifies is like the person who is really able, it's a positive cycle. They're able to spend most of their time thinking about what's going on right now. Mm-hmm. So in this, world, I think, and whereas I think where we spend now, like the average person in this system, the past and the future circles are bigger, and the present moment one is smaller. And so, it's like this concept of if you have a paralyzing anxiety about the future and how you're going to succeed and have the things that you're hoping to have, that's time that you spend thinking about that stuff involuntarily, and that draws you away from being able to enjoy what's happening right now or relax or with your friends. And the same is true if you have, crushing regret over the decisions you've made that have arrived you at this place of having the paralyzing anxiety about the future. And so I think this is how I sort of put words to what you're talking about, where what Bitcoin is really doing in dissolving that paralyzing anxiety of the future is really allowing you to just narrow your focus to the immediate, what's right in front of you. And I think typically that's where we find the most fulfillment, and it's where we experience the most richness of human connection. Like if you think about romantic relationships or relationships with your friends or your loved ones, that really shines when nobody's looking at their phone or worried about what's going to happen when they get back into the office on Monday or how they're going to pay their rent. Like it's just people being in the now. And, we have gone into this retro branding, and part of which we haven't really talked about on the last show, but we are getting a lot of like, if you've reached out to compliment us on the look and feel, like, thank you, it's appreciated. Part of the thinking behind the feeling that we want to evoke when people see block reward stuff is the idea that when money worked better, life was a lot simpler. And that's just 100% true for me. I'm obviously a little bit older than you. I do very much remember what life was like when money worked better. And it was just a lot less distracted. And I think that it's true to say that we have also seen an explosion of kind of like distraction technologies. But I would argue that the reason why a lot of those distraction technologies are popular, like TikTok, is because in the crushing anxiety society, where people find the most sort of like temporary solace is in a steady stream of dopamine hits, which is why we see a continual urge to actually get out of them right now, which is also just a really difficult, it's a sad trend to watch unfold. And I get worried about like, what is the upper limit of the compression of the average human attention span? And what will the world look like when we've arrived there? Like, is it 1 second? Like, how squished can we get in terms of our ability to relax and take a deep breath and enjoy what's happening right now? I think, yeah. So I hope that Bitcoin can return us to this place where we feel a little bit more abundant in our time. And then for anyone who, like, the connection there is, and money that does not degrade is this durable over time money should mean that we can safely store our time so that we can go outside and ride a bike. And yeah,
it's wild just to think about the fact that, like, since the dawn of time, whether we're cavemen, we've always been striving to get more for less. Life should be getting easier as time goes by, but instead life is getting harder and harder because we're continuously intervening monetarily, taking on debt, and the ability to service those debt payments is just crushing society. And, like, to your point, I think what's challenging is that because we're just seeing this constant rise in cost of living, rise in property prices, rise in basically just being able to survive, let alone thrive, people just have such limited time that when they do have a few minutes spare, they don't look to challenge themselves. They don't look to build these deep, meaningful relationships. They don't look to go and read a book. Instead, it's just, I just want dopamine hit. I just want to look at social media, TikTok. I just need to distract myself from reality. I was just recently on with Heather from the Unhypnotized pod, and we were talking about dating on a Bitcoin standard and talking about the fact that I think because everyone is so stressed financially, what we're also seeing is, like, the feminine energy, the women in society are having to step into the masculine just to be able to go survive. And then this is creating this, like, odd dynamic that's breaking down the masculine and feminine energy in society. And because of this, that lack of polarity, men are looking to porn, they're looking to all of these other ways of getting stimulus where there's just no commitment. And so it's just like this lack of commitment in life, whether it is through dating, whether it is through social media apps. And what I think we have a problem with is this idea of just, we want things to just be easy. We just want things to just be simple. And in reality, it's just like, we thrive when we challenge ourselves, we push ourselves. But if we don't have the capacity to do that, it starts to have all of these downstream effects in society, which I think is what we're seeing. Like, why are we seeing rising rates of depression and anxiety and drug use, suicide, all of this stuff? I think it's because people, they feel like they don't have purpose. They feel like they're not able to challenge themselves. They feel like they're just at the whim of a system that is getting harder and harder.
Yeah. And inside of that system, the more structural problems that result from the devaluation of money, I think, also contribute to and accelerate that feeling of disempowerment and insignificance. And these are things like what Seb talks about in Fiat food, where the incentive mechanisms behind food production inevitably cause the stuff we put in our bodies to become lower and lower quality. And that's just objectively true. The beautification of the world that we build together to inhabit is, we just don't build things with beauty in mind anymore, and nearly to the degree that we used to. And it's because we can't afford to do that. Because
we build them?
Someone built them, and at some point in time. Yeah, and this is because the input costs of materials make it impossible to think about long horizon construction times. And so, I mean, this is another very unfortunate thing. So over the last 100 or 200 years, we used to make like the smallest detail of every European building is thought out and meant to be visually appealing and of, like, the highest quality. Like these old European buildings that are hundreds of years old, and they look brand new. Like they were just built so well that they hardly seem to age. And it's like a technology that's been lost to us. And it's not that we don't try to build things that are beautiful today, but we just can't think with that long of a time horizon to create things that are equivalent. And instead I'm looking forward to this conversation that's coming up with Leon Wankum about this, because he had a really cool series of tweets this morning about how it's actually, in his opinion, not solely about the money. There were also architectural styles that evolved out of, I think, Germany in particular, that caused sort of the birth of minimalism as a way of reimagining beauty. So we'll see. Tune in for that in a couple of weeks. But yeah, I think that, so to my point, not only are we having less time and we're feeling this hamster wheel continually accelerating, while that's going on, we're also being forced to eat crappier stuff, live in less inspiring places. The light that's coming out of our light bulbs is getting more harmful.
It's profound. And I think, like, one that really hit me a few years back was going down the food rabbit hole. and stumbling across, I think there's a book called Seeds of Deception. And it talks about how during the 40s and 50s, especially like during World War II, the US wanted to stimulate grain production. So what did it do? It just pumped a whole bunch of subsidies to support certain types of grain crops. And so all of these farmers that were farming more traditional ways, farming other forms of fruits, vegetables, meat, you name it, they were suddenly incentivized to go and start planting grain because they would actually make more money because of the subsidies, artificially stimulated to plant grain. And so as a result, we saw huge amounts of grain production, and we saw the boom of Quakers and Kellogg's and these huge grain companies. Now, what those companies ended up kind of doing was the fact that because they had so much grain, cheap grain, and huge profit margins, with a lot of this profit, what do they go do? They lobby the government. They lobbied the FDA, and then they ended up pushing the food pyramid. The food pyramid, the original people that started pushing this, worked for Quakers. They worked for Kellogg's. And this more traditional ancestral diet where we eat predominantly animal-based with a certain amount of fruits and vegetables got flipped on its head, where now at the top of the pyramid is meat, and at the bottom is grain. And 10,000 years ago, before the agricultural revolution, we didn't even eat grain. And so you wonder why we're having rising rates of obesity, rising rates of like diabetes, health issues, you name it. And I think it is because we've artificially intervened in our natural flow of things, and we're supporting a certain outcome that is not natural, and we're completely throwing off how the human body thrives and what it is that we've thrived on for millions and millions of years just because we've intervened monetarily. And that's where I just think when we think about Bitcoin and what Bitcoin has the potential to do, I think that you're never going to be able to stop intervention completely. I think if the government wants to intervene and we're operating on a Bitcoin standard, awesome. It can save up tax receipts. And if it is balancing its budget and it has surplus left over, then it can intervene with that surplus. But it is very limited in its ability to do so. Whereas at the moment, you can fund full operations without the need for any taxes because you just hit print on the money printer. Mm-hmm. So I think that running on a Bitcoin standard, we're going to completely change the incentives in society towards being fiscally responsible and putting a lot more time and thought into the decisions at which we make. Mm-hmm. Because at the moment, if you can just hit print, if you're a business and you're creating a product, but you don't actually need to offer any value because you can hit print in the back office, you're never going to put much thought into the decisions that which you mean to make. And I think that's where Bitcoin is just profound. It shifts all the incentives. And if a nation state is not offering value to its populace and its populace revolt, if they're not receiving tax dollars, they're going to stumble pretty quickly. And another one is going to rise up who actually listens to the populace.
Hey everyone, quick question. Have you ever thought about starting a video podcast like this one? I want to introduce you to the team behind my show, Podigy. This podcast has been one of the best marketing tools for our business, and thanks to Podigy, all I have to do is hit record. They handle everything else: editing, writing, publishing, and making sure that it's perfectly optimized for every platform. They only work with disruptors, mavericks, and change makers, people making a real difference, spreading big ideas. Typically, Podigy is fully booked, but right now they have a few spots open for new clients. Listeners of this show get 10% off launching their own podcast or optimizing their current one. Click the link in the bio for a free one-on-one podcast planning session with Podigy. If you are thinking about starting a podcast or you have one and you want to take it to the next level, I can't recommend Podigy enough. Check them out.
Yeah, there are some really interesting ideas about Bitcoin happening to governments, and this is something I'm really excited about. I think maybe I couldn't help but mention as we move on from the food pyramid thing, we've kind of like hit the apex of that, maybe playing it out to its logical conclusion with this head of Nestlé being put in place as the head of the World Economic Forum. Like, it's just, you can't make this stuff up. It's, yeah. So what do you think about, we've got some really big players in the corporate space that are now accumulating piles of Bitcoin. Two of them are in the US. There's a recent rumor about Russia, perhaps. Russia just announced a national government-backed crypto exchange, I think predominantly for Bitcoin. And how will governments have to think about Bitcoin as more and more people understand it and they continue to want people to use their own local money?
It's a tough one. I think that where Bitcoin stumbles right now is that people aren't necessarily incentivized to use it as a medium of exchange because there are tax there's disadvantageous tax laws around it. And so obviously you've got capital gains in most countries. And as a result, every single time you go to spend your Bitcoin or use your Bitcoin, you're going to have to record that as a taxable event, whether it's a capital gain or a capital loss. And then you've got to report that on your tax filings. And so people are very familiar in the Bitcoin space of Gresham's law. Bad money pushes out good. And that only exists when there are legal tender laws, when people can basically demand that the merchant accepts the local currency because the legal tender laws exist. Over time, people hoard the good money and they spend the bad money. But what's interesting is if we start removing capital gains laws and all of a sudden Bitcoin starts to become more an even playing field with the US dollar, the Canadian dollar, I think we start to tip towards what's called Thier's law, which is more of a free market where good money pushes out bad. Where all of a sudden, if you're a merchant and you're just like, man, I don't want to receive garbage money that is losing purchasing power. I want to receive the best money. We're going to start to see more and more increased adoption of Bitcoin. So I think in the short term, it's so tough to see what this trajectory looks like. But I think in the long term, I think we need to see more favorable tax laws for greater Bitcoin adoption. That said, I think that what we're starting to see in the corporate world, what we're starting to see on a nation state level is these entities are understanding the power of Bitcoin in terms of purchasing power and the benefit it has. And so they're in this like contradictory state, especially as a nation state, where it's like, we don't want you to use Bitcoin, but we actually want to use Bitcoin because it actually helps back our currency. It actually helps protect us financially. And so, yeah, I think they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I'm hoping that if they want to try and preserve their positioning, they're going to be pro Bitcoin, but it's the Trojan horse. And the Trojan horse, once it's in the door, it's going to be hard to get out.
Yeah, and Donald Trump himself has talked about the idea of using Bitcoin to pay off the U.S. federal debt. So it's obvious that they understand it. I think they understand it a lot better than they let on. Probably a lot better would be my guess. But yeah, I have a hard time trying to see where this goes, especially, so our next episode is a Peruvian bull who's famous for an idea that's called dollar milkshake. And this is the concept that suggests the next stage of paper money is all of the weaker currencies gradually or not gradually collapsing into the US dollar before the US dollar ultimately collapses into Bitcoin. This is kind of the Highlander. There can be only one theory of money. And so I think of a country like Canada where we live, where inflation has been a lot worse and asset price inflation has been much more noticeable. And we were talking today about the cost of living here, and it really is just stupefying what it costs the average person just to be alive in Canada. And I mean, at some point, you would think the hassle of recording gains and losses against a money that just continues to be worth more and more and more than every other thing that you might want to own is going to just cause people to make their own decision about the cost benefit of not doing it. And this is kind of that safety quote of you can ignore hard money, but you can't ignore the effects of ignoring hard money.
I think what's fascinating is that we have a system built upon control, because all you need to step back and recognize is that if we have a monetary system that allows them to print more money to fund operations, then why are we paying taxes on this stuff? Why are we paying income tax? It makes zero sense. And so I think that it's a system to transfer capital from the productive to the unproductive. And I think that when you look at, most people listening to this have probably seen the charts of Canada's GDP in relation to the US's GDP over the last 15 years. And Canada has been flat, while the US has grown significantly in relation to, I think, money printing. But yeah, when you're looking at Canada's GDP, I think we've intervened so much monetarily and we've just suppressed the productivity of a nation. And when I think about a free market, when I think about the potential underneath a environment that allows value to flow to where value is being created, I see it as such a different world to the world in which we live today. And I think that the challenge, and I think you and I were talking about this, we're recording in Kelowna. Kelowna has a huge homeless population. And of course, I think from the left's approach, hey, we want to support people, we want to be empathetic, we want to give these people hope and opportunity. But the reality is, I think that it's very short-sighted, that if you give people money, you disincentivize change. And not only that, that money has to come from somewhere. So it comes through debasement of currency. So life ends up getting harder for them. And so it's just like, how do we create an environment that actually incentivizes change and aligns with the natural deflationary effects of society where prices should be falling? Because for those individuals, it actually makes life easier. It actually allows us to get ahead. It actually allows us to change trajectory or change path if we skip up or make a mistake. Whereas in today's world, it makes me feel sad to see someone has a health issue, they can't work for 6 months, and then it's almost like, that's it. The life trajectory is permanently altered and they can't get back on track. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it has to be that way.
Yeah. And as far as people who haven't caught the Jeff Booth episode or heard Jeff's ideas, like everything should be getting cheaper. You mentioned this earlier, like time. So technology typically gets adopted probably in part because whatever it does better than the thing that existed before, it saves time. It does something faster than the thing that it did before, cheaper, better, faster. So we were talking about Elon yesterday, and there's this idea that we're about to have like a massive inflow of robot labor. And so theoretically, stuff should be getting a lot cheaper. And I think this is going to be another difficult challenge to navigate as the debt piles up. We really need the price of everything to go up more. And so it's kind of like the worst time ever for a impending technological driven deflation bubble to pop.
It's what comes to mind as you're saying this is I had a really good conversation with another, I think, phenomenal Bitcoiner, and I won't name names just because I don't know if he wants to share this belief, but it's this idea that we live in a simulation and that AI is not necessarily created, but AI is discovered. And the challenge we're facing in society is that as a species, we want to create value. We want to collaborate. We want to give back. But as life is getting harder and harder and harder and harder as a result of technology, we are increasingly pressured into just this survival mode. And on top of that, it's becoming harder to feel like we're actually being able to thrive. We're actually being able to give back. And so what would we do as a society? Well, we would create some form of simulation where you step in, maybe back to a simpler time. And when you're at that simpler time, all of a sudden you feel like you can give back. You can contribute to society. You can create technology that makes life easier. But in that simulation, what happens as technology advances, as you become more efficient, you find yourself in the exact same position again, where all of a sudden, because of this technology, because of these robots, because of AI, you've basically made yourself obsolete. And so what do? We step into a simulation again. And so I think that AI is not necessarily created. AI has been discovered. We've discovered AI again because we've stepped into another simulation. We've stepped into another simulation. And this is repeatedly happening. And I just wonder, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, like if we are in a simulation, is there a way to stop this continually stepping into the next simulation because of Bitcoin, whereby if you're aligning with the natural deflationary state of things and life starts to get easier again and you have more capacity, are we able to go into maybe a renaissance period where we spend more time in the arts or things that maybe technology isn't going to replace immediately or won't replace, like something relating to the human soul, the human condition that is unrecreatable through technology?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I think that part of the psychology of feeling anxiety around the scarcity of time has to do with our innate understanding that our money devaluing is robbing it from us. Mm-hmm. And so maybe in a world where the problem of money theft has been solved, that then like as a secondary byproduct removes sort of like the biggest reason why people might want to escape. That's an interesting question, Seb. I don't know. There's a great it's called the Animatrix. Have I shown this to you?
No.
It's an animated prequel to the original Matrix movie, and it tells the story of how humanity arrived at a point where they were all living in tubes and living inside the simulation. And if you're listening it's definitely worth a watch. It sort of paints the picture of what you're talking about, this cycle where this just happens over and over again. And I don't know. I think it's possible that it's always been around. Mm-hmm. AI could be like, fire or the number zero. It's like something that is waiting to be discovered. I definitely believe that.
Do
Yeah.
you think we're in a simulation?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I definitely, like as a video game player growing up, and in the 80s, when my brother and I, we had like the very first home video game systems that existed. Like we had a ColecoVision, which was like the OG. And, as that progressed into Nintendo and Super Nintendo and PlayStation, like there were many moments along the way of feeling like this is now like these graphics are like, this is unbelievable. Like I can't, it's like, yeah. And so to see where it has gone in like 40 years is pretty insane. And so the basis for my simulation theory argument, or like the undefeatable simulation theory argument in my mind, is always been, if we can accomplish what advancement has happened in video games in 40 years, is it reasonable that over an unlimited period of time would we ever be able to create something that is indistinguishable from reality? And I think the answer has to be an obvious yes. Because if you look at, I don't know if you follow, but if you look at video games today, and I don't play them anymore, but like it's now actually getting to the point where some of them look so good, you have a hard time telling it's not actually like TV. And so give it another 15 years. I think I've talked to you about this before. I definitely do believe in predictive programming, and I think a lot of the film and television that we get to watch is presented to us for the purpose of seeding ideas into the collective consciousness, so that then when they happen, they have been like soft launched. And one of those movies that I think falls into that category is Ready Player One, which is this idea that Ready Player One happens in 2045. And at that point, almost everybody has nothing in the physical world. And so they spend most of their time online in a sort of video game simulation. And so who knows? It's your turn. Simulation, yay or nay?
I think that we definitely, and I think you and I were talking about this last night, I think we have such a small view on the reality of the world in which we live in. And I think there's a give and a take relationship that's taking place in this world, where I've been blown away as I've stepped in more intuitively and out of the cognitive mind, how the world unfolds in such interesting ways and gives you clues or gives you symbols as to maybe paths to go down or things to avoid or little hints that you're on the right path. And to me, I find that really interesting. I find it interesting because it makes me question, is this just randomness? Are we just going through life and we're just making decisions as an individual and I'm on my own little path? Or is there some form of reciprocal relationship with me and the world around me, and the world is happening for me, not to me? And so I think when I think about the world in which we live in, I think there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. As for a simulation, it's a tough one because I can definitely see the argument, like to your point, that technology is growing at such a fast pace that how do we know if we haven't already reached that point at which technology is indistinguishable from real life? And we've already stepped into that technology and we're just doing it again and again and again. Like I recognize, I don't know, as a kid when I used to play Grand Theft Auto, I used to love driving around and pretending to be a normal citizen. And I'm sure that if you'd actually put me in there and all of a sudden I felt so realistic that if I got hit by a car or if a cop shot me and I'd die, then I would be so much more conscious about how I show up in the game. At the moment, we just don't show up consciously in those games because we don't have any attachment to that game on a physical realm. But if you're able to connect in on a physical realm, all of a sudden that completely changes the dynamic, which I think would be interesting.
Yeah, it makes you wonder too if you were playing a game for that purpose and you were in it all the time, you might want it you'd probably want it to be as realistic as possible, and so that it would be as immersive as possible. Yeah, who knows? I have thought before, and I think this is possible. Back to the idea of AI, I don't think it's impossible. Like if you're putting all these simulation and AI ideas together, that Bitcoin is Satoshi is AI. Because to me, that would be, one way to think about how, part of the mystery of Bitcoin is that it was really the first successful assembly of a number of different technologies after several failed attempts to create an online form of money. And there is a lot of beautiful elegance to the mathematics, the issuance supply schedule, and like you can really go on and on. It's possible that a person or group of people were able to conceive of this, putting this together. But if something smarter than us thought about it and were responsible for it, that would also be a way to explain how it came to be.
When, as you're saying that, what comes up is we are so short-term focused, especially on the money which we're using, because money is degrading over time. We're so hyper-fixated on survival. We're not thinking long-term. And I think that if AI is indeed as smart as they say it is, and it is increasingly getting smarter and smarter, you would think that if it's thinking long-term, because it doesn't have a finite time on this planet, it's trying to think about how best can I preserve myself and maximize my chance of creating change. And what does it want? It probably wants a currency that's not manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't want to save in some currency that humans, these 80 IQ humans, are able to just debase and print to no end. And so I think increasingly, if we start to see more AI operatives and AIs making decisions, it will want to save logically in the most scarce asset, the asset that's going to preserve its ability to make change in the future most effectively. It's not going to want to save in some currency which it has no control over.
Yeah, I think AI decision makers will just purely make the most rational decisions possible. And for that purpose, I think Bitcoin is it's an obvious kind of like binary decision. And I have said before, I think that the likelihood that AI understands Bitcoin before most of humanity to me seems very high. It probably already does. It just isn't in a position to be making decisions today that it probably will be in the next couple of years based on how fast things are changing. So this is actually another part of the kind of that Animatrix prequel, as it doesn't show Bitcoin exactly. I think the cartoon was made before Bitcoin existed, but robot workers being paid in a digital form of money. And this is the other thing, I think, because there has been a lot of talk over the last few weeks in particular, impassioned pleas that we do need to spend Bitcoin, like Bitcoin acceleration of thinking about Bitcoin as a medium of exchange is something that is critical for its adoption as a technology. And I just completely think that is totally overblown. I think that before people are willing to receive and accept Bitcoin, there has to be like a much broader understanding that it has succeeded in its first function as storing value. And so that idea, we're changing people's idea about a fundamental idea that money is something that is conferred validity by a government. And that's the paradigm that everyone who's alive today has spent their entire life in. Mm-hmm. And even just shifting that over one notch to money is something that we agree on and or is issued by the government is a big move over from where we are now. Mm-hmm. And if the step beyond that is like money is money because of math and code, like that's even further. We're really having to move people a long way. So I think it's going to take quite a while. And this next, I believe, this next probably 4 years will be this next phase now where Bitcoin sort of becomes a universally accepted form of money. That might not mean, planetary medium of exchange, but it might if the AIs arrive faster than we think. And, I think that there's nothing would surprise me at this point.
You know what? And this is a slight tangent. I remember reading this article a little while back, which was talking about, well, if we have abundant energy on, let's say, Mars, why don't we just go mine on Mars? And the reality is it going to be a planetary medium exchange? At the moment, given our technology, there's too much latency in our ability to transmit information. But if you're mining on another planet and that planet finds a block, the time that it takes to send that block information back to Earth, already there's going to be a miner on Earth that's probably found a block. And so that becomes a orphan chain.
Mhm.
And so I think what's really interesting is that, is Bitcoin potentially a planetary medium of exchange? I have no idea, but I don't think we have the technology to send information at that pace.
So it's not suited to be an interplanetary monetary exchange. Yeah, totally. I've seen people talk about how, Mars would need to fork its own chain and have its own version of Bitcoin. I have my own. I'm skeptical that we're going to see that day, and but hey, if I'm wrong, cool.
I also just, honestly, for me personally, I don't understand this draw to like leaving Earth in that, like, to each is their own. But I just think we live in such a profound place. Like, you've got desert, you have forest, you have the oceans, you have the jungle, you have unbelievable ecosystems all over the world. And to leave planet to go live in a human-built dome on a frigging deserted globe, assuming that those planets actually exist, I think that doesn't really interest me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we, no matter how you think about how we got here, probably every answer, if it's like the fluke of evolution, or you believe in God and you think this happened by, like a divine plan, like all roads kind of lead to like, we are so lucky to be here at all.
Mhm.
And, each individual person, like, you're here by a true miracle. And regardless of what your personal sort of life circumstances are, we are all very, very lucky just to be here right now, especially at this time. You could have been born at a time that predated toilet paper and toothpaste, and, and pharmaceuticals, and so
I think that when it comes to the human experience, I think that money almost, and we've spoken about this maybe even earlier in this podcast, which is, I think money just completely shifts our focus, and we're focused on survival and all of these external things. We're a very consumption heavy economy these days. And I think that Bitcoin to me very much is like a spiritual tool. Whereas we gain more capacity as life starts to get easier again, as you start to save in Bitcoin, all of a sudden you have more capacity to look inwards and just ask those questions about, like, how is it that I want to show up? What is it that I actually value? And I think that when we're talking about Mars and dominating these other ecosystems and getting more resources, more minerals, more this, more that, to me, that's a very cognitive approach to life. Whereas I think that it's almost like the next stage of human development is not dominating the external world, it is understanding the internal world about where we came from and who we are and how we show up in this world. And I think it's more of a spiritual approach. And I think Bitcoin connects us to that because we're so ungrounded at the moment, and Bitcoin has the potential to ground as we have more capacity.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to have cohesive, functioning societies when the government is stealing all of our resources and energy, and we're really forced to then sort of go out and steal from each other. And I also kind of think that we have potentially got to a place where our societies are too big, and I wonder if we are headed to something that looks a little bit different, maybe where countries or communities get smaller and more intimate. And I don't know. We'll see.
Have you read the book Tribe by Sebastian Junger?
No.
That book is profound. I was in Fino and torrentially downpouring. I'm watching the surf, and I was just like, you know what? It's like 2 degrees out. I'm just going to read this book. And I sat there 3 hours, read the book straight through. I was completely locked in. And basically, it's just talking about how, obviously, from the agricultural revolution, we started to see a pivot, if you believe the narrative at which we've been told. Prior to that, we lived in much more hunter-gatherer style communities. And usually there'd be a maximum size to that community, a couple hundred people. You know everyone intimately. Whereas today, you can walk around a city and see 100,000 people in a day and not know a single person. And what's interesting is when you don't have that deep relationship with someone or that connection, all of a sudden we can perform behaviors that we would never perform in tight-knit communities. And so we have this society that is very disjointed, and people are willing to do heinous acts when those acts would never have taken place if we're in these smaller communities where there's a lot of trust and there's people are looking up to you. You have reliability. You have what's the word? You're providing value to that community, you've got to take accountability for your actions. And so I think that these larger communities have taken away some of the values which I think have been passed down through generations, through culture, through these smaller communities. We've lost those in the bigger ones.
Yeah, I mean, and this is your idea. You mentioned the second renaissance, and I hope that Bitcoin, above everything else, triggers a revival in sort of the things that happen inside that then turn into revolutions in art and culture and civilization on the outside. And that's, I would say, that when you start to understand Bitcoin, what's most exciting for me, it's not about things becoming cheaper. It's about what happens after things have become cheaper. And we can really sort of stop and smell the roses.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. What do you think, Seb? Should we call it an episode?
Absolutely. A windy episode that went a few different directions.
Yeah. This is fun. Great to have you here, and I know we're going to do it again soon.
Absolutely. Tonight, for the next 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you made it all the way to the end of the episode, thanks again for tuning in, and hope to see you again next week.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Block Reward. We're trying to do something different here, creating accessible conversations meant for people who aren't obsessed with Bitcoin. If you found this episode informative and engaging, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay updated with future episodes. Your feedback matters. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your reviews and help us with our goal of creating Bitcoin content that is simple and easy to understand. Bitcoin has an important role to play in the future of finance. It will change the way we save, spend, and invest. Discover why Bitcoin offers a game-changing opportunity for forward-thinking employers by visiting blockrewards.ca. Block Rewards' mission is helping Canadian employers implement strategies for integrating Bitcoin into compensation and benefits, supercharge your recruitment and retention strategies, and help your team members plan for the rising cost of living by rewarding their work with the hardest money ever invented. Special thanks to our top sponsor, Paramount Employee Benefits Consulting, Canada's only Bitcoin forward benefits and pension advisory. For more information, find them at paramountbenefits.ca. Big shout out to Podigy, our production team that makes all this possible, and BMX Escape for producing our music. Bitcoin is an expansive and dense topic many people walk away from early. To Bitcoin enthusiasts looking for that podcast they can share with friends, family, and colleagues, one they'll actually listen to, we hope that is us. The content of these conversations is meant to be provided for information purposes only. Nothing here is investment advice. Bitcoin is a big topic. Be sure to do your own research before making any personal financial decisions. Thanks for listening.